Hello and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Richard Crispin, CEO of Collaborate Up and one of the Routes facilitators. I'll be your moderator for today's ACI webinar on how airports can take action to combat wildlife trafficking. We're so glad you could join us today. As we're getting started here, when we will get started in about 2 minutes, I'd like to orient you here on our GoToWebinar platform because we'd really like for today's session to be as interactive as possible. We've got some great speakers and some great content, but we really want to make sure that we get to your issues, your questions. So your method for doing that today will be using our questions box and our chat function. If you are in the GoToWebinar platform on your desktop, you should see a GoToWebinar control panel. If you don't, you can also go up to the file menu and you can see up there how to get to that control panel. Over there, you should see a little drop down for questions or for chat. Either one will work, but you can then chat in your question or your chat to me, either directly or into the public chat and questions, and we'll be sure to get to your questions or your issues. I really want to encourage you to take a lot of use of those two functions there, because what we found in using these kinds of webinars is that we don't want you to hold your questions to the end. Just start chatting them in as they occur to you so that you don't lose them. So please make full use of the questions in the chat function. You should also see a quick poll up here for you. We'd love to know why you are joining today's webinar, and you can select one of the following. I am new to this topic and would like to find out more. I would like to take action against wildlife trafficking, or I would like to improve our actions against wildlife traffic. If for some reason you can't see the poll, you can chat in that question, your answer to that question. Again, the question is, why are you joining today's webinar? And your choices are A, I am new to this topic and would like to find out more. B, I would like to take action against wildlife trafficking. Or C, I would like to improve our actions against wildlife traffic. We're going to get started in about 1 more minute. So just take a moment, think about your answer to our polling question. And as I said, get yourself oriented here on our webcam tools. Make sure that you know how to chat in your questions or your chats into the questions or chat box. I will try to moderate as many of those as we possibly can. We'll also might have an opportunity to get into some live Q&A, in which case you'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself. But in the meantime, we ask that everyone stay on mute until it's your turn or until you've been called upon. Just so that we don't have any disturbing background noises. But with that orientation, I'm going to go ahead and get us started today. As I said, I'm Richard Crispin. I'll be your moderator for today's ACI webinar on how airports can take action to combat wildlife trafficking. And this morning, we're joined by some wonderful guests and great leaders on this topic. But let's quickly close our poll and see if we can see the results from what people were telling us about why they're joining today. So this is excellent. We've got a really nice distribution of people on the line today. We've got about 46% of you who say that you're new to the topic and you want to find out more. 34% of you said I would like to improve our actions against wildlife trafficking, and 19% said I would like to take action against wildlife trafficking. Well, I tell you what, I hope today we're going to move more of you into that last category of people who want to take action to combat wildlife trafficking. So thank you so much. Let's go ahead and close our poll and we can bring up our slides. As I've said, we've been joined by some great speakers today. First up for us today is Giuliana Scavuzzi. Giuliana, you are the Senior Manager for Environment at ACI World, and as such, you oversee the entire environment portfolio at ACI World, including illegal wildlife trade. You are also the secretary on the ACI World Environment Standing Committee and ACI's representative to the Routes Partnership. Giuliana, you've always been such a leader and such a clear voice on this important issue, and we're so grateful to have you and your insights with us today. Giuliana, over to you. Giuliana, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Richard. And first, let me thank all the participants and welcome everyone. Also, of course, our speakers, and last but not least, all the teams that have worked to put together this webinar today. I'd like to make 3 main observations as my opening remarks, very brief. One on the relevance of the subject, another one giving some context with the COVID-19 crisis, and the last one on how this issue is a complex one. So on the relevance, wildlife trafficking is the 4th most lucrative global crime. It is estimated that between 7 to 23 billion US dollars per year is used during those crime activities. Of course, there is a risk to biodiversity. More than 7,000 species are affected by illegal wildlife trade, according to the UNODC, and health risks as well, because those criminals, they do evade biosecurity and sanitary regulations. And economic risks are not to undermine. More than 50% of the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature, according to the World Economic Forum. And of course, related to our sector, the aviation risks, the exploitation of this sector network can really pose reputational, economic, safety, and health risks. And that brings me to my second point, the context of COVID-19 crisis. And I think this crisis has highlighted the health and economic risks. We're not going to go into the scientific discussions of where COVID-19 came from, but we are sure to understand that during those discussions during this pandemic, we understood that zoonosis is a risk of a new pandemic. So let me bring you to some numbers on the impact on the aviation sector. ACI estimates that in this year, 2020, there will be a decline on airport global revenues of around 97.4 billion US dollars, and also a decline in passengers numbers, 4.7 billion less passengers. It's a huge impact, it's unprecedented. And I think that brings us to a necessary reflection. Of course, the aviation sector did not create this pandemic, but we all should contribute to avoid a new one in the future. And as we are discussing how this sector can be more resilient, we should make sure that we are avoiding risks in the first place and work to become more equipped to respond to them as well. I think in the past, we have been more focused on the second element, becoming more equipped, adapting to respond to risks. And I think the other side of the coin, avoiding those risks in the first place, has become as relevant. And of course, with this pandemic, we have learned that we need to look into resilience from a much broader perspective, including supply chains, people that directly or indirectly is impacted or use the aviation sector, of course, our infrastructure and operations. And as we talk about recovery, we'd like to say that we need a full sustainable recovery to make sure that we can actually implement that. And on that end, we say that it's necessary to balance the three pillars of sustainability, which are environment, economic, and social. According to the United Nations Environmental Program, illegal wildlife trade and poorly regulated wildlife trade are causes of zoonosis, and of course, climate change too. So it just shows how those issues are all interlinked. And that brings me to the third point, how this issue is a complex one. It impacts different areas and different stakeholders since the orange until the destination of those criminals. And we really need to improve those links. We need to increase coordination, and we need to find ways to collaborate even more to tackle this issue. And to give you an example, at the airport site, we have several aviation and law enforcement stakeholders, and they're all working under their own mandates and roles, but they need to work in a complementary and coordinated fashion to be efficient against wildlife trafficking. And I would just like to say we have several members that have taken a leadership role, mostly under their sustainability umbrellas. And among them, I'd like to mention Heathrow, Schiphol, Galapagos, Hong Kong, and Kenya. And to conclude, I would say, as we're starting to recover, or at least to plan to recover, we need to build back better this sector. And I think we must build back a better world. And it includes less wildlife trafficking, less zoonosis, and more protection to biodiversity. Thank you, Richard.
We've had a couple, thank you so much, Juliana. We've had a couple of questions come in for you. First of all, one question was how long has ACI been involved in combating wildlife trafficking? Is this new since COVID-19?
No, ACI has been involved longer than that. We have been involved, of course, not only because it's the right thing to do, but we want to support our members to take action. For us, it all started with the signature of the Buckingham Palace Declaration of the United for Wildlife Foundation that you hear more from Rob in a minute. That was in 2016, and it was followed by a General Assembly resolution encouraging airports to take action against wildlife trafficking. I'd like also to mention that ACI Europe has added wildlife trafficking prevention on their sustainability strategy, showcasing the relevance of this subject to us. And also we have created a dedicated task force in coordinations with our environment, facilitation, and security standing committees at ACI World. And through those people working, we have developed best practices, trainings, guidance, and we have encouraged knowledge sharing. The task force is open to all members, but none of this has been possible without the support from the Routes Partnership. Routes made it all possible with the resource from USAID, with the expertise from our partners that we didn't have, and of course with the so needed collaboration that I've been mentioning throughout my speaking points. I would just like to finish by saying the aviation sector is using a slogan through this crisis, talking about recovery, and it's hashtag together we are stronger. And I can testify that through Routes we have been stronger on this topic, and I think we need to continue doing that, welcoming more collaboration as the way forward to tackle this relevant and complex issue. And I wish all the speakers and participants a great webinar. I hope we have an opportunity to engage in nice discussions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juliana. And thank you for those of you who have submitted questions. Keep those coming. We did have a couple more questions, but I think they're actually more appropriate for our later speakers, so I will get to those. But thank you, Juliana. Our next speaker is Alicia Grimes. Alicia, you are the Routes Project Manager and a Natural Resources Management Officer at the United States Agency for International Development. You have always been a consistent and steady hand throughout your tenure at Routes, helping us learn from across the entire forestry and biodiversity portfolio at USAID. We're so glad to have you with us today. Alicia, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm hoping everyone can hear me and see me. This is my first time speaking to a large audience using this remote access webinar setup. So excuse me if I look away from the camera. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. USAID was established in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy to consolidate the United States foreign assistance into one agency. As the premier development agency of the United States government and donor agency, we work with numerous developing countries around the world to help them meet their development goals. Everything from basic needs of hunger, of how to increase food security and alleviate poverty, basic health and education, addressing global pandemics, increasing resiliency to disasters, but also advancing inclusive economic growth and markets, engaging the private sector, and trying to help establish ways to counteract the drivers of instability, conflict, and other security threats, such as transnational crime. In our work, it's been increasingly obvious that the natural environment, a healthy environment, that is clean water, clean air, and also a healthy natural resource base is critical to achieving these development outcomes. And in the last decade and last several years, there's been more and more evidence that the presence, having a robust natural resources, such as healthy forests, wild animals, and plant communities, are extremely linked to better health outcomes, stronger food security and resilience, human health, and so forth, and a robust economy. As you may know, well, you know, over 1 billion people actually rely, some of the poorest people in the world rely on forest resources, for example, for their livelihoods, but also economies also rely on tourism industry, for example, that values the viewing of wildlife and, you know, bird tourism, and also, you know, sustainable timber supply and fisheries are very important. Wild caught fish are a very important source of protein. So unfortunately, you know, we have been investing a lot in conservation and biodiversity and environmental management at USAID through the decades. We have a lot of congressional support, you know, bipartisan support for supporting the environment. But as the population of the world has grown, we have seen this consumption and grow. There's a huge demand for all of these resources, and it is, you know, entered the global market, and unfortunately, often unregulated. The trade is very large, the demand is huge, and so there's opportunity for transnational crime. Now, why does USAID care about wildlife trafficking? Well, you heard some of the statistics and some of the reasons provided by Juliana just now. And about 8 years ago, or in 2013, 2012, thereabouts, there were some really horrifying, you know, reports in the media that caught everybody's attention, that NGOs such as Traffic were discovering and revealing, and World Wildlife and so forth, to the press, and it was very, very upsetting and disturbing. And so wildlife trafficking became an international policy priority for the United States in 2012, 2013, when these NGOs were reporting these atrocities. Recognizing the severity of the scale of this, President Obama issued an executive order in July of 2013 to actually combat wildlife trafficking, which led the United States to develop a national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking in February of 2014, and an implementation plan to go along with this. And USAID, along with the State Department, played a very important role. And it was a whole of government approach. So not only looking at the objectives of strengthening law enforcement locally in the United States and overseas to reduce the demand for illegal traded wildlife, but also to build international cooperation, commitment, and public-private partnerships. Now, USAID, you know, I think in 2018, we were actually authorized to spend $270 million on conservation of biodiversity alone, and 70 million of that was to specifically combat wildlife trafficking. And some of our comparative advantages as a donor, we work in over 100 countries. I think 60 of them are priority for environmental interventions, and we work closely in the embassies. We have a field presence overseas. We work on everything from policy, working with governments, but we also engage civil society, that is the nonprofit sector and the private sector. We use private sector engagement as a major approach of ours to convene stakeholders. We recognize we cannot fight this problem alone. So we're convening stakeholders in the private sector who has an interest in combating crimes, NGOs, environmental NGOs, governments, and people, citizens of the countries, to combat these crimes. And basically, that is how Routes has come about, is that bringing together stakeholders to devise a partnership where we can work with associations who can expand their reach and reach out to many of their members and scale up some of the support that we have been able to put in place. And the word routes, or routes, it's sometimes pronounced in English, it means pathway, it means a road or a directional way to go, but it also stands for reducing the opportunities for the unlawful transport of endangered species. We like to, devise these short names for the purpose of the project. And you will be hearing a lot more from Claire from Traffic International later about what Routes is all about and what is accomplished and able to offer the private sector. Basically, the goal is to reduce the use of legal transportation supply chains by criminals to traffic these products. So why would we want to work with airports? Well, airports are extremely important to these supply chains, essentially nodes where you have tons of cargo, millions of people coming through your airports, lots of transactions going on. Unfortunately, it also includes criminal elements. So airports therefore have a very important role and opportunity to stop this transnational crime, and today you'll learn a lot more about it. And I must say I'm extremely happy when I learned that ACI was joining Routes as a formal core member. And I've been extremely impressed at how much you've been able to accomplish in the year that you've been a core member through utilizing the materials that our other partners have developed and putting it on your website, through convening regional meetings and really getting the word out on how airports can take action. So today you'll learn a lot more about that. And I also want to say that United for Wildlife, as our leadership as other world leaders came to the forefront 5-6 years ago, very important role that United for Wildlife has played in raising the visibility of this issue and calling for commitments and action. Very important role, because without this commitment and action, this call for action by the transportation industry and the private sector, there would be less motivation for people to work with Routes. Routes comes in to assist entities to achieve these goals. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. That's a great bit of background there on why USAID cares so much about this topic and why the Routes partnership is working so hard with organizations like ACI World. I'm going to move us along here to our next speaker, Rob Campbell. Rob, you're a program manager, or the program manager at United for Wildlife, which is a program of the Royal Foundation. As such, you've been leading a worldwide movement within the transportation and financial services sector to combat illegal wildlife trafficking. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for joining us today, Rob Campbell.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you, Alicia, for your comments on United for Wildlife. I'm happy to talk to you all, and I'll take you through what is the illegal wildlife trade. I'll try and go a bit of detail about that, some recent developments that you've probably seen in the news, then through the task force itself and the Duke's involvement, and then onto how you can sort of play a role in that and the Buckingham Palace Declaration. But if we can go to the next slide, or can I can't control it from here. Can I change slides?
I don't think so, but I think there's a bit of a time delay, so there you go.
So if you change the slide now, and this is a short, so this is just to show you really the impact that the illegal wildlife trade is having, or certainly plays a significant part of. But yeah, if you look in the last 50 years, we've lost sort of half of the world's wildlife. So if you go next slide, please. And I realise I'm preaching to the converted, because you've joined this call and you're interested to learn more, but you would have seen this on the news. I mean, it's sort of the biggest global disruption that we've seen in decades, I would guess. But this is the coronavirus, it's still ongoing. But the likely sources of bats are one of the major ones. But it just shows the impact that maybe 12 months ago, if we're talking to airlines and airports, the illegal wildlife trade, or certainly wildlife trade, and the risk of it was probably not a significant threat. But if it's hard to argue that the result of something from the wildlife trade has caused sort of global disruption on unprecedented levels. And so where we've been campaigning, this really is something to be addressing and looking forward. And I think one big step is that you're all tuning in today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is one of the sort of other suspect involvements in the coronaviruses of pangolin. And again, I would question whether many of you would know what this is if you looked at it 6 months ago. But it's funny, it looks so innocent, it's harmless, but this is the world's most trafficked mammal. There are sort of tens of thousands of them poached every year. I mean, last year there were 2 seizures in Singapore that were roughly 14 tons each, and that equates to about 38,000 of these creatures. And so you can sort of get an idea of the scale at which this trade. It's absolutely rampant. I know these are used for scales or for meat delicacy. Sometimes the blood's used, but it's quite staggering what you're looking at. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this is really the rest of the wildlife trade. So I won't go through the statistics there, but you can sort of see that for yourself. What's really happening is CITES governs what is legal and what's not. This is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. But if we break it down, they have 3 appendixes split between different levels of endangered and priority. So the sort of highest level is about 1,600 species on that list, and over time, I think that's been around for about, CITES has been in place from about the 1970s. So since the 1970s, we've only ever seen 2% of species come off that list. So whatever it is, whatever we've been doing in the past is not working. We can say these are really endangered, we can say they're extremely endangered, but it's not getting through. The criminals are still acting. The trade is still extremely real and happening, and it takes what we feel is people like the private sector, and as Alicia was saying, to come on board and join with law enforcement, join with governments, join with NGOs and things, and that's what we try and do at United for Wildlife. But it really isn't a conservation problem. This is a global problem that all needs to be addressed. We'll go to the next slide.
Rob, if I could ask just really quickly, we've had a couple of questions come in here, but what do both you and Juliana mentioned zoonotic diseases. What do we know about the zoonotic origin of COVID-19?
Yeah, good question. So we don't know for sure, but it's extremely likely. Evidence suggests that it's probably originated from a horseshoe bat, which is a natural reservoir for countless diseases, let alone coronaviruses. But in bats, it's not a big issue. It's likely that has transferred to another species. In this case, we think potentially pangolins at one of these wildlife markets. And due to the stressful conditions, the feces and bodily fluids that get exchanged in stressful situations, it's a sort of perfect petri dish for spreading disease. And it's likely that either at the market or in the vicinity or on the journey to the market, some kind of disease transfer has occurred into humans, which is, zoonotic diseases are rare. There's a lot of them, but in the grand scheme of things, they are rare. It's rare that diseases jump from animal to human, but I think the coronavirus is a pretty good example that when they do, it's pretty catastrophic.
And then you just mentioned there, which is the next question that came in, you mentioned wildlife markets. We've heard a lot in the media about so-called wet markets. Are they different? What's the difference? Or yeah.
Yeah, good question. And I think, important to raise. I know some of the traffic guys were saying about this earlier. The key stipulation, a wet market is actually a fish market or a sort of live farmers market. So it's a bit generalistic for what we're talking about. I think that's a result of the media using the sort of the term, but I think in reality we want to stick to wildlife markets, and it's not just. I'm not going to go into how we fix this in the long run, but it's more about the species traded. What are the high risk disease types. So while I've been talking, this is just I think is useful for your audience. This is the common trafficking routes. So, and this is by air. So you'll notice quite a lot is Africa to Asia, but it should highlight that actually Europe is not alone. Europe is not guilt-free in this, and the US as well. You always hear about this on the news or in the publications that it's Africa and it's Asia. Well, actually, you know, there's pet trade in Europe and US. You know, there's significant, and it's not just about, you know, the dead animals that occur. The illegal wildlife trade is a sort of real mix of species. Go to the next slide, please. So this is something we put together recently for our task force members. We did some analysis into at the very beginning of COVID-19 to try and work out, you know, how is this going to impact wildlife trafficking? And some of these I think you'll find surprising, but I've picked out 1 or 2, 7 of these out of a longer list. But I'm happy to share with you the analysis in full afterwards if people want to share it. But you know, I think the number one there is you know, you'd be quite surprised, but actually poaching, we predicted it will increase, and it has increased on the back of COVID-19. And you know, you might think, well, surely people would avoid this kind of thing, but actually at the poaching end, you've got COVID-19 has been so disruptive. You've got no tourists in the national parks. You've got law enforcement and sort of service support staff to those tourist sites and national parks either been laid off or furloughed, or you know, if it's law enforcement, they might have been reallocated to an area of you know, more higher priority at the time, and therefore, you know, a lot of these parks have now got much less eyes on the ground, and therefore it's much more opportunistic for poachers. Not only that, but if you've got rangers with job security risks, you know, they're much more attractive to the poaching networks, and it should be it's important to understand that some of these poaching networks are not just, you know, everyday criminals. These are sort of highly sophisticated, or can be highly sophisticated, organized crime, you know, networks. And so, you know, they will pounce on opportunities like this. And we've seen, you know, an increase in Kenya. We've also seen increases in South Africa, increase in poaching in India. But it's fairly common that that's happening. So number 2 is we've seen a shift to online sales. So this is being combated quite quickly by, certainly in China, but it's due to it's harder to bring a product to market. You know, in China we're seeing this sort of ban on wildlife markets. Well, that means, you know, it's difficult to distribute the product. So criminals are now moving into online platforms, but that actually gives us slightly more of an opportunity with the private sector, because financial services can monitor those transactions, you know, probably easier than they could at wildlife markets. So it becomes less a target for law enforcement, and it opens up other sectors to help, you know, combat it. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think the one here you might find interesting: so passenger air will cease being a major mode of smuggling for the duration of the pandemic. You know, that's obvious. There are less flights happening. You know, more security on passengers, you know, getting on flights. And I hope, I don't know how it'll happen, but this audience here will probably know more than me. You know, what are the steps that are going to come into place when COVID-19 sort of starts to relax? Is it temperature checks on? Is it increased, you know, checks on what's in the baggage? But that I think will be interesting. And then the last one I'll just talk about is the traffickers' focus on proven smuggling routes. So obviously you've got traffickers. They're under now. So this is not poachers. This is traffickers, the movers of the goods. They're under increased scrutiny. So they're going to revert back to their trusted, you know, paths of transit. So they're going to be, you know, whether that's people they've bribed along the way, and it's a sort of familiar route, but you know, all in all, you'll probably see less items trafficked in general, and maybe more stockpiling, which means that you know, when this does ease, you might be starting to see a sort of influx of movement. But I'm happy to share that sort of full report with anyone who's interested. Just let me know afterwards. Next slide, please. Can we go next one?
The next slide is up.
Oh, okay. I've got a slow connection. So this is the task force. So I'm going to talk you through. If we just go back to the Duke of Cambridge one, sorry. So this is the task force. We are led by Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge. He's our president. Lord William Hague, who's one of the ex-foreign secretaries for the UK, is our chairman. The idea behind it is it's a neutral platform. You know, we're not a government, we're not an industry ourselves. We can really lean on the Duke of Cambridge's power to convene and influence, and by that I mean, you know, he's quite passionate about this, but he recognizes that there is a role for him in this, in that he can add his voice. He can, you know, in putting it bluntly, he can write directly to presidents or prime ministers, and he can table things at meetings like G20 or your UN, high-level UN meetings that, you know, if we've been banging the drum about this, you know, it's very difficult to get those global leaders to do that for us. But the Duke, that is his role, and he recognizes that, you know, under this umbrella of organizations, you know, that's the sort of power we can have. And, you know, the framework, or the quote there is, you know, we're trying to provide a framework in which, you know, private sector can come together with NGOs who have the expertise, with law enforcement who have the activity and capability, and we can sort of bring, you know, people together to ask questions, share best practice, and just generally provide the confidence that you know, that we can sort of take this forward on a, I guess, a sort of more active level. Go to the next slide, please.
Actually, Ron, we've had a couple of questions here come in that I think are relevant here. One question has been, what do you think are the most important actions that aviation and non-aviation stakeholders can take that will help to bring the numbers down?
Numbers, as in sort of what are the most important actions? I would say, yeah, I mean, it's abiding by, so for example, IATA, the International Airline or Air Transport Association, so it's abiding by their, you know, they've come out with a recent IENVA accreditation for airlines that you know, ticks all the boxes that you should be ticking. You know, in most cases, most of the airlines are probably already doing the right thing. You know, I would say it's about joining up the dots. You probably already have a very good process in how to combat narcotics trafficking. You know, if there is an alert at a baggage scan for narcotics or for explosives or whatever it is, you know, I'm sure there is a proven route for and process for how you sort of react to that. You know, I question whether there is that for wildlife trafficking. You know, and you know, it doesn't make it easy. That identifying what species is legal and what is illegal is very, very difficult. You know, so maybe there's some work to be done on how you can identify species, you know, quicker. And then it's on ensuring that law enforcement are sort of working in collaboration with say it's an airport, because more often than not, the criminals will know the times of day when they're more likely to get something through. You know, they'll know the sort of shift patterns. You know, as I say, we're not dealing with idiots. So that's what I would say. One, it's the joined up, and it's the networking capability, and then it's looking at some of the accreditation, but some of the sort of standards and things that can be fitted around your framework.
So we're collaboratively through industry bodies, which I know is your next slide here, so we can come back to that. Then help to join up the dots, use the systems that you already have for things like narco trafficking and other things, and to try to close up the gaps and look at how you can work better with law enforcement and be more reactive and more predictive of organized criminal behavior, recognizing that these people aren't stupid. They're actually very deliberate and very dedicated to their criminal craft.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think the audience will have a better time than right now after coronavirus, you know, to say this is a risk that we need to, you know, just upscale. You know, I'm not saying it should be up there with explosives trafficking, because it represents a higher risk to airlines, but you know, it needs to be some kind of risk process. So this is breaking down so that United for Wildlife, we are a mixture of a transport task force and a finance task force. So transport is air, you know, maritime logistics, and the financial task force is all the banks and things. So obviously the transport looks at the movement of goods, and we try to inform, you know, airlines and shipping companies about, it's sharing intelligence about what we've heard is moving, you know, when, and so it's trying to instigate that intelligence-led side, and then it's also sharing best practices. On a finance level, it's more looking at the suspicious transactions that are associated. So, we've had people who looked at suspicious during the COVID phase, looked at suspicious transactions around the vicinity of a national park, and they were able to identify 8 or 9 suspicious transactions that were then proved to be related to IWT. So they do complement each other. For example, if you were to have a seizure on an airline or a shipping company, the financial services part, if allowed by law enforcement, can provide a significant benefit to that investigation by following the money up the chain and tracing the wider criminal network. So you're not just targeting the mules who are moving the goods, you're targeting, who paid for that who paid for that sort of shipment, who paid for this, and start sort of getting a much better, these are complicated operations, but it's coming together. The other element of that is industry bodies. So I mentioned IATA. They're really crucial for backing this. They're just one of a number. Government is about having, in the UK it's FCO and DEFRA and things like that on board, and law enforcement, we work a lot with US Fish and Wildlife Service, but also World Customs, Interpol, and a number of others, and then NGOs like Traffic, who can provide the real training that we're about to hear about, but also the intelligence about what's happening on the ground at the time. Next slide, please. Here we go. So just breaking down into our sort of target areas. One is raising awareness across the sector. That's the benefit. The other is providing intelligence, providing intelligence which will then lead to action. And it's facilitating innovation. So in fact, I was on a call yesterday with Heathrow, who are spearheading this world-leading CT scanner, algorithm that would fit on a CT scanner that helps to identify wildlife items, which would be revolutionary. And then it's sharing a best practice. What did an advertising campaign work for this airport? Would it work for another? What were the lessons learned? Can you sort of, it's just making everyone else's life a bit easier. So that's what we try and target as the 4 objectives. Next slide, please.
We're seeing the task force results right now.
All right, okay, I'll start talking. So the task force, so these are some of the results that we've seen. Again, a lot of them are law enforcement led. That goes back to the collaboration point of it being joined up. The 170 members are across both task forces, but that's quite substantial. And then if we go to the next slide, please. So the major transnational IWT network disrupted. This is an example of, again, working with law enforcement. This was a case that led by US Fish and Wildlife Service, but from a law enforcement perspective, they really rely on some of the input from the private sector. So it's, they want to know which airlines were involved in some movement, or it's shipping companies and specific shipments they've got intelligence on. But they were able to piece together a 2-year operation that ended up in the extradition of 2 significant East African wildlife traffickers. So they were ivory and heroin. And the heroin thing, a lot of these networks, as I said, they're sophisticated networks. And sometimes they don't really care what's in the box. It's about the movement of goods for profit, or illegal goods for profit. So, it doesn't matter whether it was ivory or whether it was heroin, it's just about making money. So there's always a convergence between a number of different forms of trafficking. And that came up here, and that then adds to sort of sentence time. But next slide, please. So this one is, so this is on, what can we do next? So I'm about to talk through the Buckingham Palace Declaration. This is what we ask all our members who want to join the task force to sign up to. It's a list of commitments, which I'll go through in a second. On joining, you then we will send you monthly intelligence bulletins, which is on the trends and some patterns of criminal activity around wildlife trafficking, as well as sharing some of the sort of open source, they come from the media, cases that have come up that's significant, that we think are worth sharing. Also, we'll ask you, or we'll sort of encourage members to look at improving those policies. So it's that, IATA accreditation, it's the, zero tolerance statement. It's a sort of publicly stating that you are going to take this seriously. It's increasing the awareness within the industry. So you playing a role in coordinating some kind of message that you're backing this and you're doing it. And then it's assisting with law enforcement. Next slide, please. And so this is, I'll just talk through the Buckingham Palace Declaration. Again, I'm not going to talk through all of them, and you can have the slides afterwards to sort of have a closer look. But I'll just pick out those 4 that I've highlighted. It's really, again, backing up the encouragement of a zero tolerance statement. It's developing some kind of mechanism that will enable the transport sector or yourselves to receive timely information. So it's not just about acting on it. In some cases, there isn't someone in the airport or airline who is nominated to be an IWT rep. That's pretty clear key to get moving quickly. And then they can decide what they want to do with the information internally. Sometimes that's a sustainability person, sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it's the security manager of the airport. The intelligence tends to be quite law enforcement led at times, so it is useful to have someone who's works in conjunction with law enforcement. And then it's looking at the training for staff. And one of the slides I showed there, 70,000 staff members have been trained in IWT. That includes a lot of the traffic training that's happening. But it's really trying to encourage airports and organisations to push this message down within their staff, because how can you detect these kind of items? We saw people who carry bird eggs on them and they've hatched mid-flight. It's that sort of stuff. And then the final one is on the it's working with World Customs and the authorities. Again, it's the law enforcement side to ensure that you're doing everything you can to back them up on when it comes to that. And then final slide is just questions.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I also want to thank Bruno and Michelle and others who have submitted their questions. Please do keep those questions coming. And Bruno or Michelle, if we didn't answer your questions, please clarify them if we can ask them some more. A couple of other questions are coming for you, Rob, real quick. And actually, a couple of quick housekeeping items I should have mentioned at the top. This session is being recorded. The recording will be made available, as will the slides. We also have a number of other resources that we'll make available to you, including resources on training and on data, those trafficking routes that Rob pointed out earlier from a report called Runway to Extinction by another routes partner, C4ADS. That information is available on the routes website. That's routespartnership.org. Very quickly for you, Rob, before we move into our last presentation, what are the priority regions, and are there regional coordinating bodies?
Yeah, so this is something fairly new for us. We started obviously in London, but the transport sector, I guess, is spread throughout the globe. And as we've grown to now 170 odd members, it's very difficult to have one solution that matches everyone's problem. You'll find if you're seeing things are poached in Africa and they're being sold in Asia, they're two very different problems. So we are now looking at this regional model, and we've started setting up workshops and regional hubs. So for example, Hong Kong, Singapore for Southeast Asia. We were in China end of last year, Southern Africa one, East Africa one, and we might look to South America fairly soon. But what we're trying to do is, rather than bring everyone into one massive global body, to bring up the networks that are going to interact in this space, geographically, locally, then that's what we're trying to do, because and then they can feed into the global group. But that, I think, is a better solution.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. I'm sure we'll have more questions for you later, but let's keep those questions coming in. Let's go ahead. We're going to move on to our second speaker, but before I do, I want to bring up our second poll. So if we could bring up our next poll, please. Our second poll here is, have you trained staff or raised awareness about wildlife trafficking? Your answers are yes or no / not yet. Please go ahead and take our poll now. If for some reason you can't take the poll, you can go ahead and chat your answers into our questions box. Please take a moment to fill out our poll. While we're waiting on that, just a couple of additional housekeeping items for you. As I said, this webinar is being recorded. That link will be made available to you, as will be the slides. And we're going to go over a number of resources that you can access as well. I do also want to thank all of the Routes partners who have helped to put together today's webinar. Our friends at ACI World, of course, at IATA, at Traffic, at WWF, and of course at USAID. And if I've forgotten any of the Routes partners, please forgive me. Oh, C4ADS, of course, I should have mentioned them as well. But we're very grateful for all of their support and ongoing work. With that, why don't we go ahead and put up our poll results, please. So 56% said no, not yet. 44% have said yes. Hopefully, most of you in the no category are in the not yet category, and we'll get to that. I also understand we've had a few people who have raised their hands with questions. I can't see who's raised their hand, but perhaps our colleagues at ACI would let us know. Maybe we can take one or two questions right now. Do we have anyone? Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's go ahead and move on to our last and final presenter, and then we'll sort out the Q&A here in a moment. Lastly, we're going to hear from Claire Beestall. Claire, you are the Training and Capacity Building Coordinator at Traffic, one of the Routes partners. You have always helped to be very practical and focused on the ground, realistic implementation based on what is really possible for airport personnel and airline personnel to do. You're also based in Malaysia, so we're really glad that you've been able to stay up late with us today. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much. I do hope everybody can hear me.
We can hear you great.
We're all good there? Great, that's always a good start to check. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I'm just going to be running through just a brief introduction to the Routes partnership. Alicia already told us some of what we've been working on, and then an overview of the Routes training materials, and a little bit about how that ties in with what we found out from industry, and then the questions, if I could have the next slide. So as we heard already, the goal of the Routes partnership is to disrupt wildlife trafficking by reducing the use of legal transport supply chains. Funded by USAID and partners from the transport sector, US government, academics, and NGOs. You can see the address for the Routes partnership website. I think that will crop up later as well. But it might be a good idea to note that down, because I'm going to be telling you about an awful lot of resources that you can use if you want to become more involved in the fight against wildlife trafficking. Next slide, please. So the Routes partnership works with 5 objectives. First one, improving data analytics, engagement with corporate leadership, training of transport personnel, and that's going to be the main focus of this talk today, strengthening of policies and protocols, and increasing collaboration with enforcement. Next slide, please. So if we start off by talking about the improvement of data analytics. Next slide, thank you. Okay, stay there for the moment. So one of the most important things I think that Routes has done is it's actually looked to see where the problem is. You can see the movement to the Routes dashboard there. You can see some report covers, and you can also see one of the maps, which has been produced by our partner C4ADS. And what they've been doing is they've been looking at information on seizures of illegal wildlife, which have been moved by air. They've looked at where that's going on and the sort of ways that traffickers use to try and smuggle their contraband. So if we start with the reports, C4ADS has just produced their 3rd report, Runway to Extinction. And this is sort of basically providing an update on the other two. It's telling you what is happening now, or the most recent information that we have. Runway to Extinction is a very interesting report. You can actually download the whole thing from the Roots website, but you can also download it as a by region. So you can download the Asia Pacific section if that's more relevant to you, or Africa, etc. The Roots dashboard will give you basically an insight into the sort of data that C4ADS use when they put together these reports. And the Roots dashboard will allow you to search by country, by commodity, all sorts of things. And that too is available through the Roots website. Next slide, please. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the engagement of corporate leadership. So one of the things that Roots has done is mainly led through WWF, one of our other partners on the partnership. They have been working with leadership to provide industry guidance and action plans. So if an airport or an airline would like to know more about wildlife trafficking and more about what they can do to help combat this, the information is available on the Roots website. We can see we have best practice case studies from selected airports on combating illegal wildlife trade, how airports can take action. We also have a whole range of information on there which you can use if you want to increase awareness amongst your own staff or others. So there's posters and things, some of which are available in different languages as well. Next slide, please. So the thing of policies and protocols, and Rob talked about this, and also Juliana mentioned this at the beginning. So two of the partners that we have in the partnership are ACI and IATA. Both of these associations have passed resolutions committing to take action. IATA have their IENVA, illegal wildlife trade module, and ACI has established their wildlife trafficking task force. There are 3 industry guidance documents which have been adopted and 1 which has been endorsed, and both organizations, both associations are working together to raise the profile of wildlife trafficking within ICAO. Next, please. So it's important that when the aviation sector is working, that they work against wildlife trafficking, that they work quite closely with enforcement officers. So that if anybody sees a suspected incidence of wildlife trafficking, they know who to report it to, and they report it to the right organization, the right agency, who can actually take action against that. So Roots is working on a prototype for a reporting act, test case for automated illegal wildlife trade detection as well. Next slide. We're going on to the training, and this is actually where the majority of my focus has been. We have produced a whole range of training material, which is free for industry to download and use. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be explaining a little bit more about that as we go through to show you the range of materials that we have. Next slide, please. So the Roots team has actually already done training in a number of different places. If you have a look at this, then the rhinos are places where we've been. And thank you very much, everybody who's welcome. Some companies have chosen to develop their own training based on the material that Roots has provided. And if your organization, if your company wants to do that, we are here to help you do that. And others have actually taken the Roots training and they've run it themselves. And this is actually what we need everyone to be doing, especially in these current times. It's not possible for us to come out and do training for you face to face. So it makes these remote trainings even more important. And the materials that we have are there and available for you to use. So if we can go to the next slide, we will just go through some of the stuff that we have. The important thing to realize is that the materials we've developed have been developed for the aviation sector with industry partners. Remember that we are working very closely with ACI and IATA. They have seen all these materials. They have said, yes, These are fine, these are good, these are useful. So what we have is we have a quick guide, and this again is up on the website. And this just explains a little bit about the materials we have. What we've produced is relevant to the industry. It's designed to be user-friendly. It's ready to use. You don't have to do anything at all to it. You can just download it and use it yourself. And that download is free. We have general awareness materials, which are, everything is available in English, but the general awareness is also available in French, Spanish, and in Chinese. Next slide, please. So if we look first at the general awareness materials, we have one which is basically global in scope, but I think the most important of these are the ones which are the regional adaptations. So we've produced these for 6 regions, Africa, Asia Pacific, South Asia, the Americas, Europe, and I know I'm missing some, but you can see all of these up on the website. And these basically, all of these materials provide an introduction to everybody about wildlife trafficking, the risks, including the risk of disease that we're all very aware of now. They talk about the routes, which are most commonly used. They talk about various case examples where you can see ways that people have tried to smuggle particular types of wildlife. And in the regional adaptations, these are tailored to suit what we know about wildlife trafficking by air in those particular regions. What these also do is they show you what wildlife trafficking looks like when it's happening by air. They give the user some ideas on things that you can look out for. These are not particularly taxing. These are not very sophisticated. It's basically a matter of keeping your eyes and ears open. And then the importance of reporting anything that you see.
Claire, if I can, we've had a bunch of questions come in here, and one of the questions is, what are the red flags to identify wildlife trafficking in mules in a departure terminal in an airport? It seems like that last slide touched on that. And you mentioned that you do teach people what to look out for. Can you give a couple of examples?
Yeah, Rob actually mentioned the guy who was caught with the bird eggs hidden under his shirt, and one of the eggs hatched, or a couple of the eggs hatched. That guy had been caught before. He'd been reported by somebody who works as an airport cleaner, and they saw the guy go into the first class lounge. He's in there for 20 minutes. The gentleman goes in to see, when he comes out, to see what's happening in the room, and expects it to be very dirty because he's been in there a long time. And he notices that things are astonishingly clean. So he has a little bit of a look around, comes across an egg box, and reports suspicions to the enforcement agencies, who were able to arrest the guy. It could be something like somebody is wearing a thick coat on a very, very hot day, and they're traveling from one tropical climate to another. Why would they need that coat? They might have something hidden underneath it. Somebody whose carry-on baggage or other baggage makes a noise, it smells weird, or you see it moving. People who look as if they have something to hide. So these are things that it's easy for anybody who works in the aviation sector to spot that there's something dodgy going on. And then the important thing is to know who they should report it to for further action.
Excellent, thank you.
So the other thing that we have is the role-specific materials. These come in 3 sort of varieties, if you like. What we did was we worked with the aviation sector, we worked with ACI, and we worked with airlines as well, and we asked them who are the best people who could notice something, and they came up with a list. So we have produced training for each of these particular job types. These come as an e-module, which you can actually put on your LMS, or your staff can use it directly on the web. Could you go back one, please? They come as presentations, and they also come as what we call toolbox talks as well. And a toolbox talk is basically, it's a briefing which is usually given by a supervisor before everybody goes on shift. Okay, we can move to the next slide. You'll notice that 2 of the roles that we have on there are screening roles. One is for passenger screeners, and the other one is for cargo and baggage screeners. We are very clear in this that the role of a screener is to identify, detect weapons, explosives, etc., etc. It makes it very clear that that is the prime directive, the prime responsibility of a screener. So we are not asking anybody whose responsibility is screening to actually stop looking for what they should be doing and look for wildlife instead. What we're saying is if you see this sort of thing, this could be wildlife, and could you please report it? Next slide. So this is some of the key points for the module for cargo and baggage screeners. So this just sort of provides a little more information. These things, as I said, are all available through the Roots website. Could we go to the next slide? The e-modules can be accessed via the Roots Partnership website. As I said, they integrate into LMS. They're compatible with a whole range of platforms. These take about 30 minutes to do, and someone can pause and resume as required. Next slide, please. These are the toolbox talks. Again, they come in 6 different roles. There is instruction on how to use them within each of these. There are 4 discussion topics, and we provide extra images and examples. So the aim of this is that somebody, maybe they would do one of these every month, every 2 months. Maybe you'd like it that they could link them to another initiative, maybe World Environment Day or World Wildlife Day. And it's just a sort of reminder to support the other training that we can provide through the website, just to keep everybody's mind on the issue. Next slide. So this is just a short précis. I won't hang around on this, but this just shows the different talks that we have for each of those roles. And in common with the other presentations, this will be available afterwards. Yes, Richard.
Claire, this actually addresses a couple of the questions that have come in here, but one question was, is there information that we can share with cargo operators so that they can be on the lookout? And it looks like you do actually have a toolbox talk that is aimed at cargo.
We do. We have one for cargo acceptance, because we've heard from the industry that this is, you know, people who take the cargo in often don't recognize what is in there. So this will show the sort of documents that they would need if they're shipping listed wildlife, how they can find out, or what they should look for if they suspect wildlife is hidden in a cargo shipment. And you'll look at the end, we have staying safe or safe handling is one of the modules for each of these sections, because we think that is the most important thing.
The other question that came in that's relevant here is there a handbook that we can use to say what is illegal and what is legal?
There is not particularly a handbook, but I think it's important if you work with your local enforcement agencies, they will be able to provide you with more information. And also for cargo shippers, I think looking at the live animal regulations from IATA would also provide additional information on that.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Next slide. So this is just a sort of a wrap up. You can find out more about this, as I say, on the Roots website. And just a little bit of an introduction for the next thing. Could we go to the next slide? One of the most recent things that we have produced is our video with ACI, which is designed specifically for airports. This comes in 2 versions, one which is 12 minutes long and the other which is 6 minutes long. You can get this from the website. You can use it to train your staff as part of general training, or if you like, you can include that in a special event, for example. It explains what wildlife trafficking is, the risks, scale and impacts, where it happens, how it happens, and the importance of knowing who to report suspected wildlife trafficking to, how to stay safe, protecting others and yourself from possible risk of injury and disease. Next slide, please. So this is your gateway to all of the Roots resources that I've been talking about. You can get in touch with us through the website if you have particular questions, or if you want to get in touch with the team at ACI as well. So do check out the website, have a quick look, or have a long look even, and see what sort of things you can get from there. And I think my final slide is just talking about, if we can go to that. And this is just talking about what's coming up soon. We are working with ACI to prepare an e-module for airports. And there will also be an ACI handbook coming up on wildlife trafficking, again, aimed specifically for airports. So, any questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claire. And why don't we go ahead and put up that slide with the further information on it. And I'd like to bring Rob and Alicia and Juliana back into the conversation here. We have had a number of questions come in that I think are perhaps directed at everyone here. And one of them is really what can airports do? What key actions that airports can take if they wanted to get started today? And maybe Juliana, I'll direct that to you at first.
Sure, Richard. So thanks for the questions. There are several ways an airport can act on that. I would say the role of the airport is really that facilitator among the different actors at the airport. But for its own staff, it can definitely support with training, raising awareness, not only to staff, but public and other stakeholders at the airport site. They can work on a zero tolerance policy, again, working with their community, their supply chains, making sure that everyone understands what is at stake there. And I think it's really, really important to build the partnership and to cooperate with law enforcement, because airport authorities and operators, they do not have the remits on the law enforcement. And that's quite relevant on the fight against wildlife trafficking. I would just like to say that at ACI, our APEX program in security, which is a peer review program, includes wildlife trafficking questions, and that could enable airports to get an initial assessment so they can get future improvements on that. And using those materials, you know, get in touch with us, making sure that you reach out to our email. I shared in the chat the environment@aci.aero with our staff, try to engage with our task force. There is plenty of available materials to engage. So don't be shy, get in touch. Thank you.
Excellent. So don't be shy, get in touch. I love that. Engage. You can join in the task forces. You can take the trainings. There's lots of material and resources here for you to take advantage of. A question, perhaps both for you, Juliana, as well as for Rob. You know, Rob mentioned some of the priority regions that they're working on. Emonath asked, is there a vital role for Indian aviation in preventing wildlife trafficking? And has ACI looked at how to train airport and airline employees in that region?
Not that I can recall, but definitely if there is an interest in the region, we'll be very happy to follow up and to do a specific training. We have done trainings face-to-face and have gladly had Claire to support with those through our Developing Nations Assistance Program. So we have done that in Africa and in Latin America more than once on wildlife trafficking. So we'll be happy to follow up on that. And if there is an interest, even better, sure.
Terrific. Rob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Not too much, but I mean, I'd say, it was India, did you say? It sort of broke up a little bit.
Yes, sir.
The region.
Yes, India.
Yeah. So, I mean, Air India are one of our signatories. I think there are, you know, there is one, I think it's one of the others, one of the smaller, more regional airlines out there is a signatory. So, yeah, I would be, yeah, so in summary, yeah, I think we do target all regions. So, but I'd be happy to, if there are other airlines there that are suggested, or we certainly don't have any airports there, but we'd be very keen to sign more up.
Terrific. And the training that Claire mentioned is available to all airports? Excellent.
Exactly.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Terrific. Next question that's come in is, what is the maximum sentence for wildlife traffickers? Drug traffickers are sometimes sentenced to death, but one rarely hears of wildlife traffickers being sentenced. I think the answer is it varies. Is that?
Yeah, and often, you know, without being brash, not enough. Like, so the wildlife trafficking penalties are currently going up. It does look like in the late last sort of 6 months, they appear to be going up. And you know, I saw a Vietnamese person was re-sentenced, so their sentence was extended fairly recently when it came up for appeal. So it does feel like it's changing, but traditionally it's been very low. It's often actually no more than a slap on the wrist. And quite, in some cases in Southern Africa, you will have poachers who go out and poach something, they're caught, and then they'll sort of be given bail and they'll be back out poaching again the next day. So it's not a deterrent at the moment, is probably the answer.
And Juliana, you and Claire, I know that there are a number of resources and videos that are available. Are they available in multiple languages? Or what is available in multiple languages?
Yes, I will start and then Claire can just continue later. Yeah, we're very proud that we launched this a video with the support of routes dedicated to airports, and they can use at training. They can be used at different types of trainings that you have at the airport. So there are 2 versions, 6 and 12 minutes. We have included the subtitles in Spanish and French, and there are others to come. So we're doing a pool of volunteers to translate those and support with that. So if you have an interest in a particular language, please get in touch with us.
Terrific. Claire?
Yeah, the general awareness materials and the role-specific materials, except for the e-module, are available in English, but they're also available in Spanish, French, and in Chinese as well for the appropriate region.
Terrific. And last question, and this might be for Alicia or perhaps for you, Claire, is given that COVID has shed a light on wet markets and wildlife markets in China and Asia in general, has wildlife trafficking seen a decrease or an increase since February?
Well, I think we heard a little.
I think it's proper.
Okay.
Go, Alicia. I'll let this for you.
I think Rob mentioned a little bit on that topic in his presentation. I don't have the statistics handy myself, but and the big shift has gone through air couriers as well, is my understanding. Claire?
Yeah, so as Rob was saying, there's during the actual pandemic, well, because there are not many flights going around, then there will be a reduction, or Rob was saying that they have seen a reduction in the wildlife trafficking taking place by air, but I can't see a reason why this wouldn't increase immediately all this is over, and these guys will get back to their normal way of working by smuggling wildlife from one part of the world to another.
So my last question, I'm going to ask it of each of you, is what is the #1 thing, if you had to pick one thing for an airport to do right now, what would it be? If somebody says your thing, just say ditto to what he or she said. And Juliana, we started with you. Let's start with you again. #1 thing airports can do.
I would say speak to your community of airports. Speak with your stakeholders, because you might be surprised about individual actions they're taking there. And I think the knowledge you can gain from that exchange can direct you in terms of your immediate actions.
Start by talking to your stakeholders and your community of airports. Perfect, thank you. Alicia, #1 thing.
I would say the same thing. Increase your awareness and take the training, use our materials, and, you know, send your questions to ACI and to the Routes Partnership.
Excellent. So increase your awareness, take the training, access the materials, and engage actively with ACI and the Routes Partnership. Perfect. Thank you, Alicia. Rob?
I would, in order to be different, I would say act now. Like, you'll never get a better opportunity to gain traction with this kind of momentum. So and as sort of Claire just said, it is likely that traffickers will revert back to their usual course of action in probably a few months' time, whenever this eases. So act now. You know, start moving things so that you can respond appropriately when that picks back up.
Perfect. So act now, take advantage of this lull in time. And Claire, last word to you.
Yeah, I'll say ditto to what everybody has said, but I'd also like to say if you want to know more, get in touch, either with ACI or through the Routes Partnership. We are here to help, and we have materials and information that can help you to do more against this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you all to all of our presenters today. Thank you all for joining today. Hopefully you've heard a lot of really great information about what you can do. And I want to leave us with that final thought that Rob mentioned there, that now is the time to act. We have a wonderful moment here. And it's an unfortunate moment due to the pandemic, but it does offer us a unique opportunity that we should take advantage of to act now. Numerous of you have asked about how you can access these materials and how you can sign up for training. There's information here on the slide. We will also be forwarding individual information to each of you about how you can participate in these trainings. This recording will be made available, as will the presentation. As I've said, I've been Richard Crispin, your moderator for today's webinar, brought to you by ACI World and the Routes Partnership. Thank you all for joining, and we're really grateful to have all of you, and keep up the good work. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thanks a
everyone.
lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.